My name is Lauren, and I'm moderating. And this session, hi Will, welcome. This session is about deep adaptation. Some of you might already be very acquainted with that term and working with it in your life. If it's new for you, we'll talk about it more this morning. I'm curious, just as we're getting started, if there might be a few of you who are willing to share why this session piqued your interest. Why did it feel important to be here? Moses.
I teach ecology at Eastern Michigan University's Middle College, so it's, I'm a high school teacher essentially. And I work very much with the question of preparing students for the Anthropocene. Things will be very different and I cannot predict what challenges, so what do you do with that?
I'm really glad you're here. Thank you.
I don't think I can bring you on.
Oh, well, I've got a pretty loud voice.
Oh, there we go.
I know, people are always saying that. There's all this business out there with survivalists. I think down deep people know things are grinding toward a critical point. And some people are, you know, the rich people are establishing these places out in the middle of nowhere that they think they can hunker down and survive. Well, I'm concerned, you know, what's going to happen with the vast majority of people? And of course, churches have buildings and grounds, and can they play a part to help in all that transition? Because once things descend into chaos, it's terrible.
Excellent question. How can houses of worship be a resource? Any others? Maybe like two more? Yeah.
It does.
It's got more.
long cord.
My name's Michael, and the opportunity to work with the words adaptation and education today. So in the title, there was education and adaptation. In the other workshops, I'm not seeing adaptation being seen as a value or being lifted up as a need. That's an internal thing that we're going to have to work on. And I haven't heard that word used here yet.
Maybe one more? Okay, well, more will be revealed. So thank you. We are we're going to be working with something called the Deep Adaptation Framework. And this was kind of born of a paper that was written in 2018 by a man named Jem Bendel. I don't think that he knew what a catalyst this paper would be, but now there is a Deep Adaptation Forum. There is a movement called the Scholars' Warning. More than 500 scholars have signed on to a letter talking about what is happening in this time and how that needs to influence and adapt what we are teaching people in our education programs. There is a program called Faculty for the Future. There is a group that I just learned about from Ahmed yesterday called PLAN, P-L-A-N. Remind me, Ahmed, what that stands for?
Planetary Limits Academic Network.
Planetary Limits Academic Network. So these are resources that you may wish to look for online. The Deep Adaptation Forum is vast. There are people who are in that space around the world, and all of them coming at it in a very interdisciplinary way. So there's deep adaptation in agriculture, deep adaptation in primary education, deep adaptation and health. So if any of those are speaking to you, do look into the forum a bit. The framework uses 4 R's, cleverly. The R's are relinquishment. I would bracket that and say that as a chaplain, I think there are a lot of theological implications in that word. Relinquishment, restoration, reconciliation, and resilience. In the work that a few of us have been doing with this framework, a 5th R has been added. It is reverence. The idea of being able to work with the other R's through a spiritual lens to bring reverence to this moment feels so important to me, and I imagine many of us. And so to begin today, I want to invite all of us in whatever way you feel comfortable. I wish we had some windows here so that you could see something beyond these 4 walls, but interiorly, maybe you can go to that space. Feel free with eyes open or closed, but to just take a moment right now and recall the earliest memory you have of being outdoors and perhaps being swept up by what in this moment we're calling reverence, because conveniently it begins with the letter R, but you might have another name for this thing. Remember yourself to the sounds in that space, the smells in that space, the temperature of the air on your face in that space. And be sure that before you come back to this room, that you offer your gratitude to that space. One of these early moments of formation, one of these early moments of helping us become aware, perhaps, that we were a mammal in a living system that was holding us, that was interdependent with us, inhaling, exhaling with us. This is some of what we're talking about when we talk about reverence. And you can come back whenever you want. You can stay there all day if you want. There are a lot of names for reverence, and at the Parliament of the World Religions, of course, we're embracing all of those things, but it feels important to start from that space today. I'm going to take us through a few slides right now just to reorient us to the R's, and for those who maybe don't know the R's, to introduce us more deeply to them. So this moment that we're in is being called a polycrisis by some, because it is not only ecological collapse that we are living in, but also the things that are connected to that. There was already sort of a sharing this morning of what happens as people start to become more panicked, as resources are more scarce, as hoarding and harm become more likely. We've seen since the pandemic, certainly supply chain disruption and what happens when people are rushing to the store for toilet paper or that sort of thing. And the emotional distress has definitely been felt and discussed for me in these last 2 days at Parliament. People are talking about the anxiety and the grief that they're feeling. There are also many conversations happening about mitigation and ways that we will be able to solve or fix the climate crisis. And there are lots of ways that I think we are perhaps successfully sequestering carbon and doing some things that will be better. There's also the climate lag effect. And so we know that things are going to get more intense and more severe for the, in the very short term, right? It is absolutely too late for many places already. And there is greater intensity coming. So Project Adapt is a place that I have been tending with some colleagues. We have trainings there, there are download materials there, and I'll share a handout with you all before we leave today. But reverence is this first of the 5 R's, and you'll see here on the slide that there is an internal and an external way of embodying the R's, I think, for all of them. And reverence is that space that is the everything and the no thing, that primordial space that animates our being. Relinquishment, that space of grief and loss, but interestingly enough, also a space of liberation, because we've experienced it, right? That experience of, my example is, I come home from the backpacking trip and I say, it was really cool to only have 2 pairs of pants. Like, I don't really need all of this stuff, right? So there can be absolute lament. I don't want to shy away from that. There's so much grief and despair in what is happening right now, and there can also be liberation when we discover simplicity together. Restoration. Restoration is the space of being able to heal, return to something that was an ancient knowledge that we're recovering and reacclimating toward. It is also the act of contributing to something that can grow and be life-affirming again, restoration. And reconciliation is sort of twofold. I think of reconciliation as, in the words of St. Mary Oliver, what will I do with my one wild and precious life? I have this one life. Can I show up with love and care and generosity for as long as I have? And in a more public or external way, where are the spaces that I have caused harm? How have I been complicit in a system that has been extractive and exploitive to people, to more than humans, to soil? And how am I working to reconcile that with myself and with others? If I were a better graphic artist, you would see that blue arrow of resilience weaving in and out of the Venn diagram, because I believe that resilience is something that we acquire and accumulate because we've touched into those other spaces. When I'm part of a restorative act, I emerge more resilient. When I embrace my grief and come through the other side, I know something that I didn't know before. I am more resilient. So resilience really holds this whole thing together and serpentines through it. So there are some questions that the R's ask of us, invitations from each R, if you will. Reverence. In what ways might we claim and be shaped by reverence as primary and a trustworthy source of guidance? Relinquishment. Where in our lives can we give up certain assets, behaviors, and beliefs in order to not make matters worse or even to feel more free? Restoration. What traditional or ancient wisdom can we bring back to help us with the coming difficulties and tragedies? Reconciliation. With whom and what can I make peace with to lessen suffering and live more lovingly. And resilience. As changes increase or grow more severe, what we do, I think that might be a typo. What do we most need to practice and preserve? I have a handout that I'm happy to share with all of you that will have some of these on it. But these are just planting some seeds. And you all have other great questions that the R's are asking. So this is a collective work. This isn't me, this is we. I want to introduce my fellow colleagues and pilgrims in Deep Adaptation. To my left is Ahmed Afzaal. Ahmed has a PhD from Drew University. He is currently teaching in Fargo, North Dakota. And a fantastic book called Teaching at Twilight is going to be coming out, I believe, next month, where Ahmed is providing support for educators, parents, leaders in this time. Sitting just here in the orange sweater, Scott Quinn, who's duly ordained as a Lutheran minister and interfaith minister. He serves as the executive director of the Marin Interfaith Council in California. And Scott is also a spiritual director and has been really working with me a lot in Project Adapt. I'm really grateful for the collaboration that we get to do. And on the end is Rev Carol Dolezal, who is also interfaith clergy and celebrant. On her website, she says, I am here to celebrate the good, the bad, and the ugly. And Carol is really going to focus us today in the space of grief and loss and how deep adaptation and grief and loss are important. We're hoping that each of them will share a bit of how their pain in the stained glass window works. And then we're going to look forward to some interaction with all of you, because again, this is about adapting together. It's all of us who do this work. Ahmed. We could begin with a question. Would you like that?
All right, hello, good morning, folks.
Move the mic closer.
Good morning, folks.
There we go.
Okay, you can hear me.
Yes.
You can also see me, okay. So this 4R framework, this paper that Lauren mentioned came out in 2018, July, by Jem Bendel. That paper has received a lot of criticism, and I can tell you most of the criticism is directed against Jem Bendel's interpretation of climate science. Now I understand climate science is complex. The system is unpredictable to some extent. Models are complicated. There's speculation involved, judgment involved, so people can disagree. And so when someone says, well, Jem Bendel's interpretation of climate science is wrong, that's not really my concern, because that's not what I got from the paper. I'll give you a little background of why I got what I got. And the easiest way to do that is to say, is to mention another author, Royce Cranton. Royce Cranton, back in 2015, published an article in New York Times. It was called "We Are Doomed, period. Now what?" Question mark. Later, this became the title of his book. So, Jem Bendel's paper, well, I did not get "we are doomed" part from Jem Bendel's paper because I already knew that. What I got was the second part, now what? I had figured out we are doomed for maybe about 10 years ago. But I was stuck in now what? I did not have any answer to now what. And so that's the part that I find most useful and valuable in that paper. Because it gave me direction about really now what? Or let's say post-optimism living. My book was mentioned here. Let me just say one thing about that. There's a mystery that has bothered me for a while, and I've tried to resolve that in writing that book. I cannot talk about the entire explanation, but I will focus on one aspect of it. The mystery is, why is it that a large number of people who are intelligent and well-informed are still acting as if none of this is real? All the information they need is right there in front of them, but they continue to behave as if everything is fine, or that this information isn't real. And so I asked, what is going on with these people? Why is it that information is not enough? And so that's a mystery, and the reason I am interested in that mystery is because I was one of those people not too long ago. I'll tell you how. So, my first full-blown introduction to the ecological crisis happened in graduate school, in fact in the very first semester. And from that moment onwards, throughout my graduate studies and in my early academic career, I remained engaged with the ecological crisis. I'll mention a couple of things. In 2005, I taught a course on religion and ecology, an undergraduate course. I later published an academic paper on that topic. I watched An Inconvenient Truth when it first came out. And I followed COP15 very closely. That was in Copenhagen. So the reason I'm sharing this with you is to highlight that I was exposed to all the relevant information. I studied it, I taught it, and still I failed to connect the dots. I failed to fully grasp what these crises meant for the immediate future of civilization. It's as though I was looking at several pieces of a puzzle, but I had no idea that those pieces were supposed to connect, and there's a big picture. I had no idea what that big picture was because I did not put those pieces together. And so I was not seeing the big picture, and my understanding was, I would say, fragmented. Now, with the benefit of hindsight, I now understand, or at least I have some inkling of what my issue was. Throughout those years, my engagement with the ecological crisis and the climate crisis was primarily academic. That's the curse of being an academic. Academic, the word academic, one of the meanings in the dictionary is something that has nothing to do with practical real life. So that's the sense. There is one sense of academic that has to do with things being abstract and theoretical. And so everything I knew was confined to my thinking mind. I had not yet experienced any of it as a reality, anything that I could experience in my body. For all practical purposes, none of this was real. Now, notice, I was not denying any of this. I knew this was real, I knew this was bad, and yet it was not real. This was one topic among a dozen other topics in which I was interested. So it was not until the summer of 2012 that this started to change. I read an article, summer 2012, you might remember, Bill McKibben's article came out in Rolling Stone. global warming's terrifying new math, and somehow the time was right for me to sort of, the article triggered something. I started researching climate change, and in a few months I had learned enough to know that the chances of escaping this are very, very slim. And so by the end of that year, by December, I had, I started noticing physical effects. You might call them symptoms. A sinking feeling in the pit of my stomach, shortness of breath, palpitations. So that was the moment when this, for the first time, started to become real. Also, I started to empathize with climate change deniers. Now, obviously, I did not agree with them, but I understood why someone would take that position. I could see the appeal of believing that climate change was a lie or a hoax, because I was experiencing the distress of knowing that it wasn't. I wanted it not to be real, but there was no honest way of denying it. So the lesson here is that information, again, is not enough. Information that comes to us through discourse, written or oral, or even through images, is always a representation of reality, maybe a very accurate representation, but it is not reality as it is perceived directly. It's secondhand, it's indirect, it's mediated through symbols. And so when this information produces knowledge, at least initially that knowledge is also abstract. It's not embodied. It's conceptual and not experiential. It doesn't feel real. Now, it has the potential to become real, but that requires additional steps. And it took me several years to take those additional steps. But if those additional steps hadn't happened, I don't think I took them consciously. If they hadn't happened, I would still be among the large number of people who are well-informed and intelligent. They ought to know better, but they act as if none of this is real. So we can come back to any of that later.
Thank you, Ahmed. Scott, please share.
Thank you so much, Ahmed. And thank you, Lauren. As Lauren mentioned, I get to play at the Marin Interfaith Council. And one of the things that happened a couple of years ago is that some of the people who are involved with our nonprofit were starting to lean into some of these questions about adaptation and not feeling that there was a place to go for that to be helped. Many of them found themselves in very active climate response types of things, either with their faith communities or some of them with different nonprofits in our community, and felt that most people had not gone through the experience that Ahmed just described that they had, and they were going through that, and there was no place for that to be held. So my friend and colleague Lauren came along about that same time with this idea for Project Adapt. So at the Interfaith Council, we became a pilot project for that. So we began with the training that Lauren had described, a 4-part training, and bringing together some faith leaders, some lay people, as well as climate activists who weren't associated with any faith community, some of them had a deep spiritual practice, some not. So bringing together all those folks together for the training, and afterwards, now what? And so the group continued to meet once a month for that to be held in that sacred space together of reverence, working through the R's as a way to really respond to and adapt to what was happening with the climate crisis, the polycrises. And one shift that happened after a few months was that people really started to drop into a place of not knowing. The bit of a struggle that happened, I would say the first few months after the training, when people would come in, it was like this evangelistic effort to turn everyone in the group onto their particular thing they were doing to address climate change. Can't all of you join me in this amazing engagement we have in our community? And then the next person would go, and the next person would go, and the next person would go. And that went on for a few months until it didn't. Where people came to a space of still doing that work, but realizing this was a unique kind of circle. We now call it the Project Adapt Circle, where we could be together and grieve, we can be together and lean into relinquishment. What does that really mean? Drop into a place of restoration. What are the practices and the wisdom that we need right now? We can come to a place of reconciliation. What does that look like in our group? And for the different traditions and perspectives that are present there. So we started to shift more into being a community. How do we move forward together, given what is, rather than trying to get everybody on board with whatever a particular thing was we're doing. And as we start to lean into that more and more and form this community and this place to share deeply and personally the kinds of experiences that Ahmed just spoke about, really began to deepen together. And a couple of other trainings happened, so some more people joined us. And so we've been meeting once a month for a couple of years now. What happened earlier this year is for the first time, we all came together for a day-long retreat. And so we spent a day together to go deeper into community, deeper into the work at a place called Canticle Farms. It's really living deep adaptation in a very practical and yet generative way. And we also Lauren wove in some work from Joanna Macy. So it was a beautiful day together. That was earlier this year. So coming into the late spring, we started to ask the question, which we've been asking informally for a while: how do we take this in the community? What would this look like? And particularly some of the faith leaders were wondering how to engage their communities. I think each of them had a sense that there were a few people in their faith communities that had gone through this experience where the polycrises, the climate crisis had become real, but that most hadn't. That most accepted the climate science, but hadn't done any deep work about it. And were just going about their lives pretty much as normal. So they wanted a chance for their faith communities to have an experiential engagement with Project Adapt and with the R's that Lauren described earlier. So we have a fall schedule coming up, and I'll tell you what we have planned. So the first piece of it will be this Interfaith Sukkot service in September. So one of the people who's part of our Adapt Circle, Rabbi Alana Rosen-Brown, will host us at her synagogue for the Sukkot service, and she was describing for us how the theme of Sukkot, building these temporary structures, being in pilgrimage together, out in nature, that really was living into some of the aspects of Project Adapt, and that she wanted to bring this to her congregation, but also have some of the different faith communities that have been part of our circle to come and speak at the service. So that's going to be the start of it. It happens to coincide in the Christian calendar with the Feast of St. Francis, so calling on all the Cretan spirituality that is part of Franciscan theology. So we'll have some engagement with our faith communities around that. And then we're going to culminate in mid-October with an afternoon gathering at one of our congregations. So we have a Presbyterian pastor who's part of our group, and that happens to be right next door to the Presbyterian Seminary. And so we will have an afternoon there, and we're calling it, who do we want to be as the climate changes? And one of the changes that happened when we first floated the idea is we first said, like, who do I want to be? And the feedback from the group was, no, it's who do we want to be? Because this is about a different way of engaging rather than me, my individual freedom and rights, and I can do this on my own. That's part of the whole industrial complex that got us to this place. The collective historic indigenous wisdom is how do we move forward together? That's the reverential restoration wisdom of our traditions. Salvation is together. It's not personal. It's collective. We get there together. So who do we want to become as the climate changes? And how do we do this together? So that's our theme. And it's going to be a pilgrimage theme. So we're going to start with some reverence from different traditions, some singing, some ritual, and then we're going to have stations where people can experience different R's or different aspects of Project Advent. People will move from station to station in small groups and have an engagement with them and have different faith traditions and different people from our group taking different aspects of the R for people to have a lived experience of it and start to grapple with some of these questions and start to have it become real to them. And then we'll conclude by doing a pilgrimage together to a redwood grove at the seminary, where we'll have a lament, where we both celebrate the resilience of the redwood trees, but also a lament knowing in the Bay Area, part of what keeps them alive is the fog that is now becoming a bit unstable. So even to imagine and live into, what if these magnificent trees at some point aren't here anymore, or there are far fewer of them, and to feel that as we're surrounded by this cathedral of redwoods, and to live into some of the other lament, and also then, now what? How do we go from this place together? This is what, there's a lot of debate in our group about the word hope. Is that even a word we can use, or what does that mean? If there is any sense of hope, is that that the group can agree on is that what is happening, we respond together. We become and evolve together. We adapt together. We move forward together. We are pilgrims moving together. And that's what we want to have people lean into as they leave, and that'll be our ceremony. That both we go to a very deep place of some grieving and lament, and then join together, we move together and lean into some response. So I can tell you a little bit more later if you want about some of the stations and what we're doing, but that's where our group is right now and what we're going to be offering this fall, and how Project Adapt is this lived in a very tangible way in our community.
Excellent, excellent.
Thank you, Scott. It is good to have some examples, right, of some ways that we could try to make this more visible. And just a reminder, it has taken our circle a long time to feel into how we talk about this with other people. So if you feel like you're still with like trying to find, you're in great company, and we do this together. Carol's gonna talk a bit now about grief, loss. I'll let Carol talk. But then after that, we are gonna hold some questions together, and we'll break out into smaller groups.
Thank you. So I really appreciate, I'm at the end of the table for a reason. I would consider myself, I told Lauren when she asked me to be on this, I'm like the lay person who's coming to the table late. So just like Ahmed said, you know, and I consider myself intelligent. It's really because of my young adult children that I have become more aware of this situation, and also because of my training at the Chaplaincy Institute, where I got to take a course with Lauren. And I was raised on a farm in Iowa by Depression-era parents. For those of you in the States, the Depression, there's a certain mindset of people, but also what we call the colloquialism of Pollyannas and rose-colored glasses, just ignore everything. And this is reminding me of that again. We are in a time where the climate change deniers, I'm just seeing that more and more. But my work has primarily been with grief and loss and death and dying and hospice. So as we were talking about this, you know, a lot of my job is accompanying others, where we know what's going to happen. And all of us know from the moment we're born, we're dying. So I'm accompanying people to help them make meaning. And I'm seeing some parallels here where we in the faith community or in community at all, it's a time where we need to come together to help accompany, knowing it's not gonna change. Things are really grim. But how we accompany, a lot of when I'm asked to preach recently, I've been preaching a lot, I was sharing with Lauren about my butterfly theology. So my butterfly theology is basically because it also equates with the Buddhist story where the person asks, you know, how can you take away my loss, my pain, my grief? And the Buddha says, well, go to every house, and if you can bring me back a mustard seed from a house that has not experienced this, then I will share that. And of course, the person goes from door to door, and everyone's experienced grief or loss. And that's not just death. Loss of a job after COVID, loss of ways we live our lives, which we might consider training ground for this stage with the polycrisis too. We are going to be changing in the next future how we live on this planet as it continues to die. So in the butterfly theology, the way, and I have butterflies everywhere. I actually learned about butterfly theology when I worked in Syria, and from a dear pastor friend. The idea that the caterpillar, what it takes to become a butterfly, I don't think some people do, probably in this room more people do, but it's a lot of work. It's not pretty. It's a gooey, icky, messy struggle. And most of the way, the messages to the caterpillar of, I just can't do this, I can't go any farther, I can't do this. But at some point, the butterfly wings emerge. And then the really sad, sadistic thing is that the butterfly doesn't live very long. They die pretty soon. It was all that work for that. But to me, that's the meaning of life, is like most of life on this earth is struggle, is what I call the goo stage. How we keep going, hope. I love that there's controversy about hope. I am a Pollyanna. I want to always, and I also know, and I've experienced deeply pain and ickiness, and I've accompanied people through pain and ickiness, but having that hope once of the wings, and then going, then it's like as soon as you get there, it's like boom, you're back in the butterfly or in the caterpillar stage, and you're in that goo, and you're in that tunnel, and you're in that struggle, and you're like, I can't do this. Well, it seems like we're in that time now. There's something about knowing about getting those wings that maybe can help us keep going through the goo. As my mom would always say, I am from the Midwest, so I use a lot of these little sayings, but the bitter makes the sweet sweeter. But I also think, along with the butterfly theology and getting there, is that when you get your wings, you start seeing other people. And I often say, look around the room, look at each other. It is the word community, when you were talking about community coming together. It's also like a hospice house where I work. We'll have somebody, the patient who is dying, and it's interesting to see the community that comes around. Some of us who are providers, care providers, who've never met this person, but we become part of their community. They have all this assistance. But then there's the friends, the family, the loved ones who come and circle around. And it's not gonna change the outcome, but it makes it a more blessed event. It makes meaning of how we got to this space and time. Yeah, it makes meaning. So how we continue to do this, I think that's the work right now that I see, is acknowledging, and also maybe more people like us. Like, I feel like my role on this earth is to be like the regular person who, I'm not an academic and I'm not a big leader, I'm just Carol. But I see a lot as I've traveled the world. It's like using my voice and sharing my experience and my story, and like each of you now, we just went through this wonderful exercise with this very sad documentary. The Week, is that the name of the program we did? Lauren can probably share more about that program. But it's a way you could gather people in your home, in community, to talk about these issues. I have 25-year-old twins. One has been a huge activist about divesting from fossil fuels. She's not gonna have children. There's no reason to bring children into this world. The other one is probably gonna get married and have children. I'm terrified for the life that my perhaps future grandchildren are going to have here. I hope that we can find community to figure out how to move through that. And one last thing I'll say is, just like with hospice and death and dying, I always tell my families, because people think, you know, well, this person's gonna come and show up for me, or this person's like at a funeral or at end of life, you think this person's gonna come and say goodbye, and sometimes they don't. And it's not that it's wrong, it just may be the timing, maybe they're not able to do that. So there may be somebody in the community circle, it's just not there yet, or like we said, maybe they're intelligent, but they just haven't gotten to the point yet where they realize this is a reality. But then the surprise is the ones that do show up are the ones you often don't expect. So I don't know if any of that made sense, but I'm gonna go on. Okay. And I think that now we have this beautiful group of people and lots of experiences here. Be gentle with yourselves in these coming days, these coming years. And look at each other right now and just see somebody perhaps you've never met before and know that we are in this together.
Thank you, Carol. So I'm going to read 3 questions, and I'm going to give each of you a chance to respond to any one of the questions briefly, if you would like. And then we'll use these same 3 questions in small groups so that we can give our own hearts, bodies, minds a chance to respond to these questions. And the questions in the US and a number of other places in the world, it is currently very difficult to embrace adaptive practices since we are simultaneously still stuck in systems that are making things worse. Please offer an example of this and describe how you are working with it. So, again, we'll give any of these 3 a chance to respond if they wish to that question, but you also might be thinking for yourself. A second question that might speak to you: as you have allowed yourself to recognize and accept the magnitude of ecological tipping points, species loss, and systemic breakdown, what are you learning about grief? What are you learning about hope? And a third question question, if the first two didn't grab you, how does reverence, or your spiritual practice, however you define it, accompany you in your collapse awareness and adaptation efforts? So my friends, let's start with Carol this time. Any one of those questions that moves you in this moment, and a brief response, please.
Could you say the first one again?
I sure can. In the US and a number of other places in the world, it is currently very difficult to embrace adaptive practices since we are simultaneously still stuck in systems that make things worse.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I have two, but perhaps, and the hard part is, how am I working on it? Anyway, part of my journey, I tell my children I've had 8 lives. I'm not sure what the 9th life will be, but part of my life was working in Lebanon and Syria. I was assigned to the Synod of Lebanon and Syria, working with the Near East School of Theology. And traveling in other parts of the world too, is just some of the systemic things that happen, like driving through the cedars of Lebanon and seeing the hillside filled with plastic bottles and trash, and it was just so heartbreaking to be in this beautiful part of the world and see, you know, there are places, and I also have pieces of art now where people are trying to be creative, but you know, areas where tires and oil cans have been left on a country that can't sustain, there's nowhere for that to go. So now they've started making artwork. I don't know if you've seen out of the oil cans, some beautiful artwork. Or I have a purse here that actually, I didn't even think about this. I have a purse made out of tire tread for tires. That's how they recycle or repurpose. I guess, what am I doing about it? Well, that's a good question. That's a charge for me to think about more. You know, I know there's conversations I have with beloveds when I'm in those regions, and there was a lot of conversations like, why is there so much litter and trash in this area? And these are all intellectual people and trying to figure out, but a lot of it is the systems. There's nothing in place to put it anywhere else. And it reminds me back to the time when I grew up on a farm and there was nowhere to get rid of old appliances, so people would burn, like have these big fires to burn. I think about that now, it horrifies me, but that's what we're up against, is what do we do to change that? It's a huge systemic thing. I'm adding more questions.
I'll respond to the reverence question. For me, my spiritual practice is largely our backyard, where every morning I sit in our garden.
With your pig?
Our pig usually hasn't come out yet. She comes out. Our pig, we have a pig named Dolly, Dolly Pigton, or sometimes we call her Dolly Ronette. And so yeah, she lives in the house, but she has an outside area. So right after my meditation time, she'll come outside. So thank you for mentioning her. One of the things that having so many animals and chickens and bees is it decentralizes human beings for me. It decentralizes human beings. I live in this gifted ecosystem of our backyard, and I'm just one part. It nourishes me, I nourish it, we're all interwoven together. And one of the ways that I'll sometimes live into that is we have bees. We just harvested honey this past weekend. gratitude for the bees. It's not uncommon to see dying bees in our backyard. Ladies who have given their lives to nourish us and all the plants in our backyard, and now their wings can no longer take them back to the hive. I could sit there and hold vigil until she dies and honor her. And her life is no less precious than mine. That's part of how I practice reverence and how it reorients my soul to my place in things as the climate changes and as I realize the web of life that'll keep going in whatever way it's going to keep going in my place.
All right, I'll try and say a couple of things. First, Carol mentioned hospice. Well, hospice has now become a verb, and there's a wonderful book called Hospicing Modernity by Vanessa Andreotti. And the whole idea is that we are at the end of modernity. We don't want to, we're not trying to kill modernity because it's already dying. We don't want to keep it alive either because of all the havoc that it has created. All we want to do is to give it a decent burial. Just let it die. And she is, but in addition to that, she also says, well, we also have to act like midwives. So when one thing ends, something else usually is born or begins or starts. We don't know what comes after, but we should assume that nothing comes after. Maybe there's nothing, maybe there's something. So let's keep that open, that possibility open. I can say something about hope. All right, so hope. What I'm learning about hope, what I found about hope is that hope has three meanings, and in fact, I would say we shouldn't even use the word hope. We should specify which hope are we referring to. So there is hope 1, there is hope 2, and there is hope 3. Okay? So do not say hope until you know and are able to say, well, is it hope 1 or 2 or 3? Okay, hope 1 and hope 2 are about the future. Hope 3 is about the present. Hope 1 refers to a wish. I hope it rains today. I hope it doesn't rain today. Right? That's a wish. That's hope 1. Hope 2 is a cheerful feeling about the future. I'm hopeful about this project, which means I feel that this will be successful. It's a feeling. All right? Feelings come and go. I feel hopeful in the morning, but then late in the afternoon when I'm hungry, I'm not feeling hopeful. So feelings are real, but they may not refer to anything objective. That's hope 2, a cheerful feeling that something good is happening. Hope 3 is what we want to focus on. Hope 3 is not about the future. Hope 3 is about the present, and it is a trust in the worthiness of a way of being. So I am, let's say, I'm acting in a certain way deliberately with intention, because I think it's the right way or it's the right thing to do. And my motivation to be that way or act in that way is not increased by if the probability of success increases, and it doesn't go down if the probability of success goes down. It's not connected to the future. It's entirely about the present. I will do this, or I will be this way because it's worth it or it's valuable. That's hope 3. So I say we ditch hope 1 and 2. Well, we don't ditch it. We can use it. Just say hope 1, hope 2, hope 3.
Great, so let's spend perfect. We're gonna have about 15 minutes in these groups, and so I think if each group is 4 to 5 people, everyone then will have a few minutes to respond to the question, about 3 minutes each. And again, you can choose one of the 3 questions that I shared, or maybe there's something else that's just bubbling for you and wants to be offered in your group. Yes?
Will you read them once more?
Sure. So in the first question, really it's to say, how am I working with my desire to be more adaptive, to be using these adaptation practices, even while I'm still feeling quite stuck in a system that is often making things worse. And so the invitation is to offer an example of this. Carol spoke about plastics. I would probably talk about freeway traffic. Something like that. How am I working with this? The second question, as you have allowed yourself to recognize the magnitude of what is happening, what am I learning? What are you learning about grief? What are you learning about hope? And then the third one was, how does reverence, or your spiritual practice, however you define it, accompany you in your collapse awareness or adaptation efforts? Or choose something different. Adapt. And why don't we, there's roughly 20 of us in this room, but clump yourselves together in groups 4 or 5, just take a minute to do that.